Okay, so now to the critical feedback. We have three very competent, excellent speakers. One is the commissioner of the study, so it's a conflict of interest in some ways. You cannot trash us completely. Anyway, we start with Nicola Searle from the IPO.
So I'm Nicola Searle. I'm an economist in the Economics Research and Evidence team at the Intellectual Property Office. And as Martin's just noted, we co-sponsored this project. So this is a knowledge exchange project, which is quite an interesting format because it allows for policymakers, such as the Intellectual Property Office, and academics to interact in sort of creating research and asking questions and answering them, and methodologies. So in this case, we had Chris at the IPO office working with us for a few weeks, which is really a useful way for us to understand what the current thinking is, methodologies, and also for us to explain kind of the policy context, etc. So it's always, it's a really good way of bringing together policy and academic research. So in this case, we got, or we are in the process of getting, a report on public domain and what that means and the value of the public domain to the economy. I wanted to compliment the report, first of all, because as Martin said, I'm in a biased position to do so. And we've got quite a few interesting points in the research and public domain coming out of this report. So one is the idea of methods, and I was quite excited by the initial research proposal because this really looks at new ways of collecting data and new ways of looking at the public domain. So partially because of the advent of the digital era, we have a lot more opportunities to gather data electronically, which weren't possible in previous times. So, for example, we have, and I loved this phrase, we have computer-assisted human coding, which I like to think of the sort of cyborg researchers out there being computer-enabled, basically gathering data that A, was not available, and B, didn't exist. So as we go forward, we're getting to the point where we have time series to do some of this data analysis, and it's very exciting. And we've got some good examples in this research project. The other is we've got, I think if you could look at the different types of projects, and we didn't get to the Wikipedia one today, but it is in the printout that you have, essentially extensive case studies of how public domain is used in different arenas. And I think that's also very good for illustrating the value of the public domain. Additionally, quite a bit of clarification for businesses, which we've been discussing, and that kind of feeds into, creates wider work in promoting copyright and things like the copyright user portal, and really making it more clearer for users of copyright and how they can use it. So it's all very exciting in terms of promoting the use of copyright and public domain. From a sort of more content perspective, I really enjoyed the first discussions we had looking at the definition of the public domain, because if you look at different types of research, both sort of policy research and academic research, and of course within academic research quite a bit of variety, how public domain is defined. Now, in policy debates, it's often construed as things carved out of copyright, whereas this project starts from the opposite, where copyright is things carved out of public domain. And I think we have variations on those themes, and then we have exemptions, which I'll come back to in a second. So I think that's really important, that when we look at policy and we look at public domain, that we're remembering that it could be either of those two, and that it's easy to forget when we talk about public domain that the users of public domain may not be as vocal in arguments and public policy debates. So again, kind of flipping the definition or the used definition around is a helpful way of looking at things. I also like the fact, and I think this came from Chris, the idea that public domain is constituted through use. So again, something that we don't particularly think about is public domain is what is created through the use of it. And again, it's this kind of a constructed, different way of looking at copyright, which we don't normally see in public discourse. And I also thought it was interesting because essentially when we look at the value of public domain, we've kind of been in an international experiment on the value of public domain through essentially the misuse of copyright over the last years. With the advent of file sharing, a lot of users and internet users have essentially treated a lot of copyrighted items as public domain, essentially. It's not lawful, but it's kind of given a wider context to what public domain is and how copyright and the value of the content itself interact. So again, it's all very important for considering these in policy. And that brings me to the point on an economic analysis perspective, which Ruth Towes mentioned, is the concept of value in public domain and in creative goods in general. And this is a challenge because we have a number of unique characteristics of the creative industries which make the calculation of value in copyright very difficult. One of the things that the project touches on is the value of the network. And this is kind of where Ruth was going, is that the idea is the value of the content stems from the network itself. And then we have Metcalfe's law, which suggests that the value of a network is related to the square of its nodes. So essentially, the network effect is the idea, the more users in a network, the more valuable the network is. And where I'm taking this is the idea, again, with public domain content that's being reused, it's the value, it's the content that was deemed valuable by the users. So when we talk about Shakespeare, for example, it is universally regarded as valuable content. When we talk about all the other items that were created in the same time as Shakespeare, we don't talk about them because essentially we've already deemed them to not have any value as a network. And when I say network, I mean as a culture. So when we look at public domain, we start from significant bias in the sense that we aren't able to look at the stuff that is no longer in use or no longer in print. And that was another point also from Ruth, looking at the cost of identifying those that are not necessarily considered as valuable, so all of those other works when Shakespeare was around. And that makes it difficult, but it also is the same thing that you see within content within copyright. So again, it's that creative industries are often associated with the network effect, so that you still have within current copyrighted goods some that are universally regarded as very valuable and others that may not be. And this network effect makes it, again, very difficult to put value numbers on this. But I wanted to also point to the fact that this work really looks at two sides of public domain, the value. One is from the business and supply side. So we have the potential risk management, and that's something that particularly came up when we look at the transmedia. So the idea that using public domain through Kickstarter gives you a bonus. So it reduces the uncertainty associated with the production of new content, or rather the reproduction and meshing up of public domain content. And that's very useful for business because we know that there's a high degree of uncertainty in the creative industries. So any content that allows you to reduce that is quite handy, particularly for SMEs. And we've seen this with the Jack the Ripper case, for example, and Jane Austen. The other point being that it also reduced the costs, so potentially getting, when we talk about computer games, using public domain may help break free of the work for hire scenario, which isn't exactly inspiring for computer game developers. And then it also reduces, as we touched on, the information asymmetry between business and consumers. From the consumer side, it's also creating a lot of new ways to consume goods. So we have public domain games. I don't think Jane Austen imagined her readers would eventually be playing on computer board to interact with her characters, but it's really exciting and it creates a lot of more value, and that's another thing, the key thing that comes out of the research. It also engages co-creation, so we have the ability for users to really engage in different ways with public domain materials. And I really liked, and this we didn't get to this point because it's in the Wikipedia, the fantastic figure, because these kind of figures are quite useful in policy debates, that, and it's noted in your handout, the Wikipedia, correct me if I get this wrong, the Wikipedia public domain photos in English language pages were estimated to be worth 200 million a year. And that's kind of the exciting type of figure that is always has quite a bit of currency in policy debates. In terms of policy, we've got an ongoing economic debate on the value of public domain because it's always challenging to associate value with intellectual property in general. So quite keen to have more on that. You'll also note that in the last year we've introduced a lot of exceptions to copyright which have expanded the public domain. So we have the personal copies exception, so you can now make copies, the character, parody, and pastiche exception, and this got my colleagues very excited because we managed to get a mention on Have I Got News for You? So always exciting when your work goes into the public eye. And then things like the quotation exception and a number of exceptions expanding the right for educational and research users of copyright. So again, expanding copyright exemptions, the use of the public domain, and a lot of value questions. So what I'd like to see next, and some of these are personal musings, this is actually cited in the research as the idea that more research, again, not a biased comment, is needed. The idea that further quantitative research could be done, and I think as we expand our methodologies and we have more time, we'll have better data available to us, so the idea of wider quantitative studies will be feasible. The other thing I was thinking about was the interaction between PD, so public domain, and other rights. So if you think about public domain as a decision to, for example, if we're talking a very wide definition of public domain, including freely available via license, but still under copyright, that's a decision to disclose. And the flip side of that, of course, is the decision not to disclose, which kind of touches on trade secrets. So I wonder if there might be interesting tensions between other property rights and public domain. The other question, which is not an IP question, and this is one of my musings, is what will happen to the role of privacy and public domain? So when we start to get into big data, what will be carved out of the ability for that to be used freely, and what will stay within that because of privacy concerns? And finally, I'm looking forward to the workshop and how we can use value of public domain to encourage growth and innovation in the UK economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Yeah. Okay. Next in line will be Ben White from the British Library, across the road.
Yeah, it's been a terribly long and arduous trip over the road. And I'm the second Ben from the British Library we have on today, I think. So I've been asked to just talk about some of the interactions that we have with the public domain, and then offer some thoughts on the study. So first of all, I suppose I would say that as a large, or probably the largest archive in the EU, we interact with public domain materials in lots of different ways, and one of them has nothing to do with copyright. So even if copyright has expired, we are extremely mindful of things like religion, sensitivity, traditional knowledge. So, just because it's in the public domain doesn't mean that you can necessarily freely use it without upsetting, for want of a better word, certain communities. The other sort of musing that I have is, as the National Library of the UK, I'm wondering if we have the smallest public domain compared to comparative creative economies. So if you look at the US, for historical material, pre-1923 content is in the public domain. So if I get on a plane, I can see an estimated 500,000 books coming from Google and US universities that are geo-blocked from the EU. And then one of the gentlemen from the games company talked about the Jack the Ripper letter. Some of you may or may not be aware that there's a campaign at the moment called Save Our History, #Catch2039, which is all about the fact that in the UK, material that was unpublished before the 1st of August 1989, and the author died before the 1st of January 1969, are all in copyright if they're from the UK. So that means that essentially we have material from the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, up until the beginning of the 20th century that are public domain in France or Sweden, strong for music, Denmark producing the best television. So I wonder actually if our public domain is smaller. So moving on to the BL, we interact with the public domain in a number of ways. So we have a group called the Access and Reuse Group at the BL, and that's essentially about deciding what we will actively, through our own digitisation or through digitisation with third parties, put into the public domain and then label using the public domain mark from the Creative Commons as public domain. So that resulted in the Flickr project that we heard of earlier on from Ben number 1, that we are actively putting stuff into the public domain. And that's resulted in the Burning Man example, people making skateboards with pretty pictures, people tweeting about how they're using some of the 16th century manuscripts which we've illegally put into the public domain because, as I said, they're still actually in copyright in the UK until 2039. So we've got sort of lots of nice anecdotal examples. Hopefully this video that you can see behind me is an example of a study, a sort of a prize, a competition that we've got going with Game City. And here, a company called Pudding Lane Productions produced this game and a fly-through. So and I think this is an important point. The study, I think, looks predominantly at organisations that sort of use the content. And I'm certainly aware that through projects like this and other projects that I'm working on which are using openly licensed content, that actually part of what the study calls the platform innovators, what they're doing is they're not only using the content, what they're doing is, in terms of businesses, producing valuable algorithms and valuable search engines. So they're doing things like sentimental analysis. I mean, depending on who you talk to, 14 to 20% of all web traffic are organisations who are scraping and doing data analysis. So what we see is companies, SMEs, off being able to access public domain content, creating technological value, not through the content directly, but having hosting services and creating algorithms that have real economic value that make their venture capitalist investors very, very happy. And I do think, again, anecdotally, certainly one SME that I work with who wants to mine open access content, so material that should be publicly available under a CC BY license, but there's nothing in the metadata, nobody knows really. As a country, at the moment, we're investing something like £14 million in buying articles to be distributed for free under Creative Commons attribution licenses. No one really knows because it ain't in the metadata. So certainly, if we're classing, which I think we have, Creative Commons licenses as public domain, there is definitely a dearth of material for the technology companies that I've been working with. And as I said, that's just because nobody is actually spending the time. The research councils have not mandated that the metadata must say, if University College London has spent £2,000 on this article, that the metadata coming from the publisher says this is CC BY. That's not happening, and I think, again, this is one reason why the public domain is smaller than it could be. Moving on to, again, an area of the study that isn't really there is we work a lot in terms of public-private partnerships with secondary publishers. So secondary publishers do various things. The largest market that I'm aware of is they digitize public domain content, create databases, and then sell them to research universities all around the world. And these companies are a significant part of the modern publishing industry. Again, moving back to science, if you look at science publishers, the larger ones, the ones with more money, have retro-digitized their public domain backlist, and again are selling their backlist. So I think that secondary publishing is an interesting area. We work, unfortunately, most of them are American companies, and the company that I'm about to mention, one called Bibliolabs, is also American. They works with us taking public domain books from the Microsoft project and produce a nice little app that was free, and if you want more books, you have to pay for, available through the Apple store. So again, there's a large and significant secondary publishing market that doesn't fixate on, you know, the Jungle Book and Sherlock Holmes and that kind of thing. You know, this is a broad and kind of deep breadth of content. So, in terms of next steps, I would perhaps, in terms of the report, I think if there was an annex which gave real case studies, you spoke, I think, to 12 SMEs. I think it would be really good to make the study with an appendix at the end, actually have the case studies so people can understand what it is these companies are doing. Maybe for further studies, I would really like to see an emphasis on the what are called the platform innovators. You know, the value isn't just in the reproduction of the content, it's the value in the algorithms and the search engines that are being created by, you know, lots of different companies to do lots and lots of different things. And then I suppose finally, again, I would be interested in something that the university sector across Europe is increasingly being vociferous about, and that is the public domain nature, or not as the case may be, of facts and data. So we talked about data and big data. Certainly the university, the research universities in Europe are at the policy level very happy that the UK introduced an exception for text and data mining. But actually, we do see intellectual property as being a barrier to the reuse of pure fact and pure data, which of course will sit within text and music, but the extraction of facts and data, which, you know, I would see most people would agree that the pure expression of fact and data is not subject to intellectual property. Actually, what are the economies there, given that we definitely do live in an era of big data?
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. Okay, now we move on to Wikimedia and Jonathan Cardy.
Good morning, everyone. First thing I'd like to do is thank the researchers and so on for their interest in Wikipedia and including Wikipedia in one of the case studies on this. We do have a very active research community in and around Wikipedia with its own regular newsletter, etc. And I'll make sure, if you haven't already come across that, you'll mention that, because I'm sure they're bound to want to include that particular bit of research in the next newsletter. A couple of clarifications I think would help in that particular case study in terms of how Creative Commons licenses and so on are used around the Wikipedia universe. And just to explain a little bit of background on that, you've probably all heard of the English language version of Wikipedia. I'm assuming everyone has heard of that. And that's, in terms of our 500 million or so unique visitors a month, that's probably about half the total. Most of the other half comes from the German language and the other 285 language versions of Wikipedia, and tiny dregs comes from Wiktionary and Wikiquote and the various other sister projects to Wikipedia. And a significant minority comes from Wikimedia Commons, which is the media library that's behind all of these. And the reason why it's worth mentioning on this context is that the individual projects can allow a bit of extra media information on top of what's available on Wikimedia Commons. So Wikimedia Commons only accepts public domain information or information that is very openly licensed. So CC by SA is about as restrictive as you can put on there. If you try to put a non-commercial file on there, it will get deleted. And if you try to put a no derivatives file on there, that will also get deleted. Some of the other, and also fair use would not be acceptable on that one. The English language Wikipedia, by contrast, does accept fair use images because it's based in the United States. In fact, one of the reasons why when Wikipedia moved from Florida, London made, I think, the shortlist, but San Francisco got the jobs and got the etc., is that the United States has a significant advantage in terms of being more commercially focused for IP and so on, and was a more suitable environment for Wikipedia to be based in. Though, which brings me on to that $200 million a year figure that. If any of you, has anyone seen the fundraiser banners that have been going up on Wikipedia recently? one or two people admitting to that, and there's a certain amount of they seem to get a little bit more intrusive every year. The total budget of the whole of the Wikipedia movement, including my salary and various other things, and actually supplying coffee to the programmers and keeping the computers running, the total budget on that is a very small fraction of that $200 million a year figure. So it would, those banners would have to either become much more intrusive or shift from an annual fundraiser to a monthly fundraiser if we were to try to get anything close to that 200 million figure. So realistically, what we would be doing if we didn't have access to public domain images is that we would be making more use of effectively, we would have a lower quality to Wikipedia, and quality is one of the key drivers on this. One of the things that I was interested in with this research, and where there's a potential future on this, would be to actually look at quality of images on there, because you were simply going for a binary status of is there an image or not, and one of the things that would be very interesting for the community would be, well, how much does a high quality image make as in terms of extra eyes on length of viewers or time on the page, and another aspect that wasn't looked at was how long people actually spend on that page, that's not a criticism, it's just an opportunity for the future. We do have information available as to how long the typical viewer spends on a particular page, and one assumes that having an image, having more text, would increase the amount of time that people would spend on the page. Having a better quality and more relevant image might also. And that's one of the things where having images available makes a real difference. Now, we've all talked a little bit about how the UK is deficient in some respects on IP. I just wanted to give an example where the UK is actually ahead of the vast majority of countries, and that's on freedom of panorama. The idea that a cat may look at a king, and in fact, if that king is permanently on display in terms of a statue, you can take a photograph of it and upload that and make any use that you want on it, because that is that freedom of panorama thing. And we have a range of legal situations across the world, and an attempt in Europe at the moment to converge on that, with unfortunately some countries have a non-commercial freedom of panorama, which we don't accept, and I'll explain in a minute why we don't accept non-commercial on Wikipedia, and some countries don't have freedom of panorama at all. So, for example, in Italy, a building may be extremely ancient and the architect revered but hundreds of years long dead, you still wind up with the local authority, in theory, has some control over the IP of people taking photographs of that particular thing. Now, most tourists will ignore that, but the pedants amongst my colleagues who guard the public domain nature of Wikimedia Commons would delete an image if they said, well, actually, no, this breaks the relevant laws, we can't have this one, we can't quote this one, or somebody has uploaded this image but they manually put the words non-commercial in the license and overridden that thing. Well, sadly, that has to go with a nice little note on the page saying you can release this, but not under that image. Where the UK is streets behind a number of institutions, or most UK institutions, because this is an institutional level thing, is over the commercial model of handling IP. There's a larger proportion of UK institutions are cautious rather than commercial when it comes to looking after the IP of their collections. And that's the reason why people ask us, why are these articles on British battleships illustrated with German photographs? It's generally because there's a German archive where they've said, let's take advantage of Wikipedia here and release a whole load of images under relatively low to medium resolution. So if you want to illustrate an article on a turn-of-the-century British battleship, you'll probably wind up using a German photograph, and the commercial revenue that's likely to be generated, if we're realistic, of people saying, well, there is a photograph available of that battleship, where do I think I can get a better resolution version of that from? That will wind up going to Germany rather than the UK, because there's a German institution that's more commercially minded. Similar thing applies with international relations and so on are there. It's one of the things that we haven't covered particularly on this because people are very commercially focused on this, but there's also the whole issue of international restitution and the amount of information that we have collectively in the West that people in other parts of the world are really interested in getting their hands on. A lovely example of this is the Troppenheim Museum, I think I got that right, in the Netherlands, where they have a huge collection of imagery from the former Dutch colonial empire, and a large part of which is now known as Indonesia. And they released a huge amount of imagery online, including lots of images from Indonesia, and our colleagues in Indonesia are absolutely excited and delighted and so on about that. And I know, I'll just put a little subtle word in for today, that there's an important meeting of the British Libraries Access Committee next week, and my colleagues in India would be absolutely delighted if they got a similar release of certain images from India. And it's one of the things where we have it's moving away from the commercial side of things, but one of the things where we have something of a responsibility in a way as the custodians of lots of stuff from the 19th century particularly, but from the colonial era. There is an argument that that goes beyond the commercial side of things. The other thing I would say on going back to the study, it is possible to illustrate an article on a person who died in the 19th century with an image that's under CC by SA. Typically, when you see that happening, it's that somebody has seen a statue of this general or whatever. If it's in the UK, they've then taken a photograph, uploaded it as CC by SA. The photograph, even if the statue was only erected 20 years ago to some, well, that's unlikely, but even if the statue is relatively modern or still under copyright, and the UK you've got freedom of panorama. I think under I'd be less clear about American things, but I haven't done much photography there, so I don't have to worry about that one myself. But that's one of the, and talking to the people who did the study, there were a few examples within the older stuff on there where articles were being illustrated using things like photographs of statues. And if we didn't have access to public domain and of oil paintings and so on, and we were more reliant on things like that, you would have more articles where instead of having a photograph of this particular person, you would have a photograph of a statue of this person, or a photograph of a plaque they'd unveiled, or a photograph of a house they'd built which is still standing, or a house they lived in which is still standing. So people can be quite innovative in getting round some of these limitations, but it still winds up with, well, if you're reading about somebody who was a mid-19th century Victorian general, it's nice to actually have a picture of them, just as nowadays it's nice when you're reading about an article about an actor or an actress of the 1970s, it's nice to actually have a photograph of that individual from that time, rather than them opening a village fete 2 years ago, 20 years after they retired from the stage. So I think with that I'll wind up and take part in the debate later on.
One quick question. You promised to say why it's so essential that commercial use is possible for Wikimedia materials. I think that's very relevant to us.
Our aim is to make the sum of all human knowledge available to the whole of humanity. And we realise that part of doing that is not everyone's on the internet. So part of the way in which we're getting that information out there is that people are including Wikipedia articles within magazines, within books, within printed literature which may be sold, that's going out into parts of the world that are beyond the internet. So there are routes like that. There are various other routes where people want to make a commercial use, and by doing so are making information available to other people. And the other reason, and possibly the telling reason on this, is that there are arguments as to what is a commercial use and what is not. And there are people who have this business model of releasing information under a non-commercial license and then trying to argue that particular uses of it are commercial as opposed to non-commercial. And by saying we don't accept non-commercial, we avoid that shark-like business practice. Thank you.
Okay. I would like to give Chris Erickson an opportunity to respond on behalf of the project team to what you've heard.
Great. And I'll be quick, I promise. What happens after the panel is we're going to have a quick interactive activity, and then there will be lunch, and we will finish by 1 o'clock for lunch. So, assurances. Thank you very much to all the panelists for your really close reading of the draft report, and for your very, very helpful comments. I think I'd like to start with Ben, perhaps. I really think that your 2 points about things that are potentially missing, that are white space in what we've looked at, are really important to consider. I'm less familiar with the secondary publishing idea. We just talked about it before the panel. But your point about platform innovators, I certainly understand, and I think that that is really important. And I guess I would probably like to turn the question around back to you and to Nicola a little bit, and ask, on the provocative point that you make, which is that the UK actually has a diminished public domain with respect to that kind of digital innovation. Why that is, and what kind of policy options might be taken in a direction which would stimulate that kind of platform innovation, because it does seem like a shame if American companies are coming and essentially raiding the archives of Great Britain and then turning a profit globally, selling that content. I mean, it does seem like a really interesting and important potential area that we have not considered in our report.
Yeah, you can do it quick.
I'll just, because so what you've kind of referred to is the implicit assumption that in the US, because of copyright conditions there, that some of these companies have been able to grow where they perhaps weren't able to do in the UK. One of the challenges with that is that tends to assume that all of those companies were in compliance with American copyright law when they started. And if you look at entrepreneurial literature, typically most startups are breaking heaps of laws when they first start up. So we don't know for sure that actually some of those companies were in compliance. And there's been a number of very expensive court cases since then that have clarified that. So it's possible that some of the, and I should say this is where I'm the economics side of the IPO and not the policy side, it is possible that some of the actions would be available over here, but it might require court cases to clarify that. That said, as you've seen, and thank you very much for noting the text and data mining exemption that we also included, that we are expanding it. So hopefully we can, the whole point of IP in the UK is to incentivize innovation and growth. So hopefully we'll continue that.
Okay, we'll, one immediate response and then we'll have a few questions.
One thing I wanted to say earlier on is I think is that working or is it coming from here? One of the things I wanted to say was I think And Tony may or may not remember, and I've no idea if the study was linked to this, in the now defunct Intellectual Property Economics Advisory Group, I suggested that some research on the public domain would be valuable. Really, again, at the policy level, because at the World Intellectual Property Organization is, as part of the development agenda, was supposed to have looked at the value of the public domain, and I'm absolutely unaware that any such research has taken place. So I think globally the study will have value and should be sort of promoted as a global study. In terms of the two specific questions, I think on the secondary publishers, probably, and unfortunately, the reason that most of them are American companies is because America is a larger market. There was one very active UK company in the secondary publishing space called Adam Matthew, and they were bought out recently by Sage, who is an American company. So it seems that this space is because of the dynamics of the market, controlled by American publishers. I think in terms of the kind of the big data mining question, I think it is very clear that Europe as a whole has a less data-friendly IP environment. It's very clear that American companies who are doing the data analysis, and again I repeat that stat that between 14 and 20% of web traffic is robot scraping, so there's a huge amount of data analysis. They shelter under fair use, they assert fair use, and I'm certainly aware of some UK SMEs who intentionally, because of this, do no data processing in the EU. They do the data processing in the States. So you know, all markets are complex, and IP is one element of this. You know, it's availability of venture capital, it's the network effect from you know, other sorts of technology companies in the States, but IP is in the mix.
Okay, let's have a few interventions if they're wanted. Yeah. Would you mention your name? Okay. Maybe it's quick, better than that, but yeah.
I'm a television producer and I also make apps. I'm sorry to be so sort of, I may be very dim here, but can we go back to the Routemaster bus on Westminster Bridge with the House of Commons behind it and explore what it is about that was not within or was within copyright? I wasn't clear. I really wasn't clear. Can somebody explain it to me?
Our expert, Danusia.
Yeah, but I can do it quickly as well.
Yeah.
Basically, UK copyright law protects it as a photograph, and then the question is the substantial taking?
So
is a substantial part of it taken?
So it's a television
and then there's quite complex doctrines which feed into that, which we can't touch now, but that's the reasoning.
I don't understand, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be an exact copy to infringe. If it takes enough of the underlying composition and...
So it is a panorama. That is an infringement of panorama then?
No, it's not. It's not the building, it's not the infringement of the photograph. So it's not the.
So if I put a tripod down exactly at that place and reproduce that photograph on film, I'm breaking copyright.
Probably not, but it's really complicated.
It's important, isn't it? Because it was stated as a case.
Yeah,
It
was an injunction.
Is it
Something?
true or not?
Yeah, I mean, one piece was that. So maybe the first thing I should say as well is that there was already a case between these two companies previously on a similar picture, and the defendant in fact tried to invoke the claimant's picture, but tried not to infringe it. So they wanted, almost like with parody, you want to kind of almost think of the original work, you want to create that image, but then you don't want to infringe it. And as Chris has already mentioned, it's about taking the substantial part. So in the court case and in the court judgment, they looked at things like, has the substantial part been taken? They acknowledge that there are common elements, but it's the way you actually put the common elements together. There are plenty of other pictures similar, or like with the House of Parliament, a Big Ben, but it's the way the claimant had put them together with that lighting and with that kind of with all of that was infringing. I don't know if that's still clear, or maybe I can have a chat to you as well afterwards.
No, it's a clear description. I'm just wondering what the elements were. I mean, was it a bus, the House of Commons and Westminster Bridge?
It was greying out the background and having a red colour.
But those elements are in the public domain.
Yes, but not necessarily in combination.
Always in combination. Whichever
No,
way.
but it's important.
Yeah,
It's an important question.
yeah.
I think we shouldn't spend too much time on the legal rule. But
No, but from the point of view of people taking photographs and reproducing photographs, it is important, because if we are going to be in a position where one photograph is in the public domain and one is not, and one is a commercial photograph but is slightly different from the one that we are at sea, aren't we?
no, that's right. But I think that particular case is also very specific to those facts. You know, what happened in a competitive situation, and it is really. I wouldn't extrapolate from this case that you can't take a film on Westminster Bridge with a red bus. You can, but it would take too much time to go through the details of that.
Just don't grey out the background.
Intended to copy the claimant. They intended to copy. So that was the important element.
So
that
the intent to copy that
if they'd done it just by chance, it wouldn't have been an infringement, but they actually intended to copy.
Okay, so it's the intention to copy them. That is a law.
Well, you have to show a causal connection. But anyway.
I think one important consideration, and one which I was always used when enforcing copyright, was if it was proving access. If you've had access to the original, then you're already on the slippery slope towards infringement. But can I raise one other question? Actually, there is a fifth element of public domain, which is quite an interesting one, which is things being in the public domain as a consequence of the behaviour of the owner. Perhaps it's the lack of enforcement over a period, or perhaps even the inability to enforce. I think that's probably an important area which needs to be looked at, particularly as a consequence of globalisation, in that quite a lot of European folks are applying the US standard of fair use because of it's so much easier to do so. Thank you.
Well, our initial study had a study on fan games in it, which we also will publish. But the IPO was slightly nervous about including that type of abandonment within the scope of the public domain, because it may look like endorsing unlawful behavior. So I think there's a political reason, and I think we can be frank about it. But I think in practice, it is an important
but also
aspect.
an important practical reason for not including it, which is that the rights holder often reappears.
And then there's trouble. So from the point of view of use, as you know, we want to think about how the public domain is actually practically useful to creatives in the UK. The problem is that if there's not absolute certainty, then there will be risk aversion about uptake. So.
Hi. This is more linked to the...
Would you give your name as well?
Sorry, this is my name is Lily. I'm attached to the UK IPO for 6 months, but I'm originally from Singapore. I thought I'll get that out of the way. This is originally kind of linked to the Kickstarter program, but I think it's kind of applies generally. I think this idea that public domain the public domain that we know of usually is the more commonly known stuff, is the more famous stuff, the Alice in Wonderland, the Shakespeare. I think that's been bandied around. Has that been taken into account in terms of the value? Because I think that the issue that came up to me when I was looking at the Kickstarter thing is that when you use copyright that is in the public domain, or when you use copyright that's third-party copyright, that actually reduces information cost to the backer, because the backer already knows that this is Alice in Wonderland. This backer already knows. So when looking at a project that is original content as opposed to a project that includes public domain, it's not just about, I know that this is Shakespeare, but it increases the value of the project. So the fact that it is commonly known public domain might actually mean that the project on Kickstarter, for example, is more valuable to the backer because the backer already has a background of how it actually works. So there is somewhat a interrelationship between value and the public domainness of the copyright work, but also the fact that most of the stuff that we do know that is in public domain, automatically know that it's public domain, is already very famous things. So just wondering whether that was kind of explored in the project.
It's one possible explanation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fabian, do you want to?
Yeah, I think we tried to capture that element a little bit by the argument that it allows the project creator to set a better price for what he's doing. So it reduces his information asymmetry. I think we have reflected that in that way. However, I must admit what we have not done, what we have not done yet, it could be added, is an identifier for whether the public domain material that is used can be deemed to be very, very famous or not. That could be an important additional layer of analysis that we can add in the future. Thanks for the suggestion.
Okay. One very brief response from Jonathan, but then we...
Just want to add on that there's another dimension that comes into there, and that's your confidence of this actually being public domain, because there is a risk. And if it's something where you can say, well, I can check when that artist died, and it's obvious to me that, etc., then you have greater confidence on there, which of course reduces risk and so on and so on.
I think we have to close it here. We've got half an hour left to do our workshop, and as part of the knowledge exchange concept, it's quite important that we do it. Chris will introduce it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, all the panelists, actually.